Hey everyone, Dr. Libright here with your week 7 video. And if you didn't know, this is the last one because there's no new material for week 8. I really just want you to focus on preparing for your final. So today we're finishing up the textbook, doing chapters 12 and 13 on subcultures, racism, and cultural appropriation, as well as masculinity, industry, and environmental sustainability. So I'm going to start with lecture, review, exit pass, and reminders. Jumping right into the new content, let's dive into chapter 12 on subcultures, racism, and cultural appropriation. Now, some of this is review because we're going to talk more about Bourdieu and his work on class and distinction. And then, of course, racism has been a theme throughout our semester, especially when we talk about social institutions and institutional racism, as well as terms such as intersectionality, where we're looking at multiple identities and multiple forms of marginalization. But let's backtrack for a second and start with art. Art is a cultural creation experienced by audiences as fundamentally aesthetic and not as functional. Although certainly there are, especially contemporary artists, who play with function as part of their artistic expression. Now, this connects to Bourdieu's work on taste and socioeconomic status and sort of how we have distinctions when it comes to our taste in art based off of things like social class. So remember, taste is an individual aesthetic preference central to one's identity. This means that your tastes in things like art are personal. You have your individual preferences, the things that you like. However, we think that there's a lot of agency or choice in the art we like. So the music and paintings, films, all those things that we like, we think that that's very individualistic. But in reality, social patterns heavily influence our individual tastes in art. So Bourdieu talked a lot about that in terms of class and status, but certainly we can think about this in a more intersectional way, looking at other identity categories such as gender or race. So when we think about these identity categories, we also have to think about symbolic boundaries, which is the use of culture to create and maintain group boundaries. If you think about us versus them mentality, when people have similar attributes to us, often physical, things that are socially constructed like gender, race, and class, we use those identity categories as markers for who is in a group with us and who is not in a group with us, outsiders. Part of all societies, all cultures, is that we have these symbolic boundaries that are socially constructed. Then within societies, we have subcultures. These are smaller cultural groups within a larger culture, distinct from the larger culture, and sometimes, oftentimes really, defined by opposition to mainstream culture. Now, you might recall from my master's thesis research that I presented earlier in this semester, I look at subcultures with regard to higher education and college campuses. And so I look at party subcultures, for example, on schools that have that risky student behavior associated with party schools that the Princeton Review has sort of codified with their top 20 party school lists. There are certainly other types of subcultures that exist on college campuses. So, a commuter school where very few students live on campus in dorms, that's going to look very different, the culture on that campus, compared to a residential campus where the majority of students live on campus. They live in student housing and dorms and things like that. If you think back to last week in total institutions, definitely residential campuses are more likely to be considered total institutions based off of Goffman's definition that he coined for that term. And then finally, if you think about community colleges, they have an even different subculture than a residential school, a party school, or a commuter school that's a 4-year school. All right, but we can also think about subcultures in other contexts. And so, if you think about the 1960s and 1970s and hippies and the counterculture, that's sort of a classic example now of how we as sociologists understand subcultures. These were folks who were really in opposition to mainstream culture and mainstream society, and they wanted to go on tour, go see live music, and not be essentially not be functioning members of society. So, not wanting to have a high pressure job, things like that. I encourage you to think of other examples of subcultures, especially in a contemporary setting. All right, continuing on with this chapter and honing in more on racism, which again should be review for us. Racism is hierarchical ranking and differential treatment of racialized groups. And so in sociology, we tend to think about interpersonal ways in which racism plays out. So prejudice and discrimination that occurs in our daily lives and our everyday social interactions. On the micro level, if you're thinking about the macro micro analysis that our textbook authors often deploy. But we can also think about how racism plays out institutionally within social institutions like higher education. But we can also think about institutionalized racism in the prison system, within religion, family, all these other social institutions that are really the foundation of sociological thought. Both are important, but certainly interpersonal forms of racism would be more micro, and institutionalized forms of racism would be more macro, more big picture. Prejudice is the biased beliefs about a social group. So you're not necessarily acting on those beliefs. Discrimination is when you actually act on those beliefs, treating people differently, including the denial of equal opportunities and rights based on perceptions and social constructs when it comes to race. And again, we talk about how race is a social construct. A great example of that is in the United States. We do the census data every 10 years. That data is collected by the government. And we've seen over decades that how the federal government asks members of our society, of our country, what is your race? The different options that are provided has evolved pretty much every time we do the census, every 10 years. And so we can see that race is a social construct because it's evolved over time, even within one specific country. We're also talking about privilege, which we sort of talked about last week when we were talking about intersectionality and oppression. But when we think about privilege, it's the advantages that white people experience because of their race, and it's oftentimes invisible to those folks who experience the privilege. And so, if we think about privilege in terms of race, the privileged group is white folks because we carry advantages simply for being born white. And it's easy for folks who are white to say, oh, I don't see race, or to not think about the way race impacts their everyday experiences and how they're able to operate in this social world. I say they, we, because I'm white. Um, but it's important to think about whiteness and what whiteness means for my lived experiences, like for me as an individual, as well as just, as white people within that subgroup or within that group. Now, white is in parentheses here because we can also think about privilege in terms of other identity categories. Again, if we're thinking about gender, the privileged group would be men. If we're thinking about class, the privileged group would be upper middle class, one percenters, and arguably middle class folks as well. All right, finally on this slide, we have cultural appropriation. This is a use of cultural elements by outsiders, non-members of the cultural group traditionally associated with this tradition. Now, sort of the classic example we use nowadays for thinking about cultural appropriation is when Black hairstyles, Black ways of dressing and dancing get culturally appropriated by white pop stars. And so if you think about cornrows as an example, a lot of white pop stars have experienced backlash for wearing that hairstyle at a performance or in a music video because it's the appropriation of Black culture, of a Black hairstyle. Some other examples might be folks going to music festivals such as Coachella wearing Native American and indigenous headdresses as a costume. So anytime you're wearing another person's culture as a costume, that's sort of a red flag that cultural appropriation is happening. And then finally, during Halloween, this oftentimes is an issue where folks will wear a Halloween costume that is someone else's culture. Now, the last example I want to bring up is Hawaiian culture. This perhaps is a little less obvious. Perhaps people aren't talking about this in sort of mainstream spaces the way some of those other examples have sort of quote unquote gone viral on social media. And so this is when folks wear fake hula skirts and leis and coconuts and things like that, and they have a quote unquote luau themed party. This is cultural appropriation of Hawaiian culture, and in fact, many Native Hawaiians really find it problematic when folks on the mainland, or even haoles who maybe are living in Hawaii and are a little more familiar with Hawaiian culture, when they throw these types of parties, it's upsetting. It's an erasure of Hawaiian culture and uh, what hula and that those outfits sort of mean to Native Hawaiians and that particular indigenous community. So I'd like to use that as an example because I lived there for 7 years, almost 7 years. That's where I did my PhD. And I learned a lot about Hawaiian culture when I was living there. I studied and took classes, and I also incorporated Hawaiian scholars into my dissertation work to ensure that I thought through what contextually it meant to collect data and have a case study in Hawaii. All right. The last chapter of our textbook, chapter 13, Masculinity, Industry, and Environmental Sustainability. So the textbook authors start off this chapter talking about the United States and car culture. They argue we have to think about cars both in terms of a material good and a cultural aspect of our society. So if you think about a car, it's a physical object. So it's a material thing, it's a material object in our society. But especially in the United States, where, car culture reigns supreme, literally our infrastructure is designed for cars. We also have to think about the cultural aspects of cars. We can think about how, depending on what type of car you drive, the brand and style and all of that, it is symbolic of different aspects of your identities. And so if you drive a brand of car like a Mercedes or a BMW, it signifies wealth. It tells us something about your socioeconomic status or what you're aspiring for in terms of your socioeconomic status. And if you're driving a hoopty, maybe that tells us something else about your socioeconomic status, right? We can also think about how within the United States, car culture is so significant to our society. Look at our streets, look at our highways. Every state is connected by a massive system of highways, and there are a lot of cities, maybe not Chicago, but there are a lot of cities that are huge in the United States where people say, oh, you can't live there without a car because we haven't invested in public transportation across the entire country. Definitely in South Carolina, where I've been living, it's more rural. You have to have a car. You can't walk anywhere, even if geographically a place might be close to you, it might be a mile or less away from you. If you go to other countries, like Europe, for example, the infrastructure there was created well before cars were invented. And so the streets and the infrastructure in a lot of European countries was not designed for cars. It's very difficult to have a car in many major European cities. You don't have places to park. The streets are really narrow, so traffic builds up. However, they tend to have better infrastructure with regard to public transportation. And so it's easier to take a bus or a train, things like that. Aspirational commodity is the idea that something appeals to consumers and it exceeds their economic ability to acquire it. It symbolizes a desired future lifestyle or identity. And so this is connected to car culture because oftentimes we'll see folks having really expensive cars that perhaps they have to take out a loan to get. They may not they might be living a little bit outside of their income in order to have that symbolic car, that car brand that's expensive that says, oh, I'm wealthy, or I'm aspiring to be wealthy. Fordism is mass production in large quantities of standardized commodities. Obviously, this comes from Ford and his system of sort of the assembly line efficiency production model that's become synonymous with American capitalism. We see this type of mass production in all commodity goods, but it really got its start in the mass production of cars, and in particular, Ford cars. It also, part of Fordism is the minimal variation. When you're creating a bunch of commodity goods on an assembly line, you expect that every single item being produced on that particular assembly line is essentially going to be the same. And so if you think about something like a car, if all Ford F-150s are the same, if you go to a mechanic shop and you need new tires or you need a new engine, it's going to be easy to get that replaced or fixed because all Ford 150s need the same tires, the same engine, the same parts. Versus if there was a lot of variation, it would be much more challenging to find the right parts for your car. This started with the Ford Model T, introduced in 1910. Production for Ford peaked in 1923. However, this idea of efficient productivity, it really carried over into all aspects of American consumerism. Post-Fordism is the era starting in the 1970s to present day, when there was an economic crisis in the 1970s, sort of marking the beginning of post-Fordism. This resulted in flexible, globalized production. So if you hear parents or grandparents talking about how there was this economic crisis in the 1970s and all these jobs went overseas, this is what they're talking about. We start seeing more globalized production of commodity goods, and a lot of factories with assembly lines start being created in other countries, in developing countries, rather than here in the United States. Materialist values are values rooted in economic growth, consumerism, and industrialization, closely connected with consumption and capitalism. And then finally, post-materialist values are social relationships, self-actualization, and harmony within nature. Okay. Now, of course, as always, I have to do my due diligence and say, remember that there are other vocabulary terms, theories, and methods from chapters 12 and 13 that you're responsible for the final exam. But I want to end today's video, this week's video, with a review of the overarching themes that were introduced at the beginning of your textbook, because your authors continue to use these themes to analyze the social world throughout all 13 chapters of the textbook. And so we have micro, macro, thinking about micro and sort of individual, small scale, everyday aspects of our social world versus sort of big picture macro stuff, thinking about social institutions and institutional ways in which the social world plays out. This is probably the most intuitive of the overarching themes for students to understand. Next, we have material and culture. Recall from the beginning of our lecture, I talked about cars and using that as an example to apply material and culture. So you have material goods within a society that make up our culture. But then you can also think about the culture and the symbolism that those items have. And so a car is just a car, but in the United States in particular, it also is symbolic of different aspects of your identities, and those are all culturally specific. Structure and agency. I think the last time I made reference to this theme was when we were talking about social institutions and total institutions last week. Another great example is if we go back to Bourdieu's work on taste and art, which we covered earlier in this week's video. We think we have a lot of agency when it comes to what types of art movies, TV shows, music that we like. But in reality, social structures are at play and they heavily influence what we even have access to in terms of the art that we're going to be able to consume. And so, definitely, social class influences, probably people from a lower socioeconomic status are not going to see the opera, or if so, they're not going to go often. But folks from wealthier socioeconomic status are going to see opera regularly. They have access to that as a potential type of culture and art that they want to consume. And so class matters when we think about the consumption of art. That's a structural aspect of art at play and what kind of art we can assume. But we think we have free agency to like whatever we like, right? We don't want to think that these bigger social structures are really so heavily influencing what we like, because what we like is a part of our individual identity, it's part of our sense of self. And then finally, this is not one of the overarching themes from the textbook, but I also encourage you to think about intersectionality and how you can apply this to different aspects of the social world, both micro and macro. I've tried to do this throughout the semester in all of our weekly lectures. Um, Last week, you watched a TED Talk by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the theorist that coined the term intersectionality. My goal is that you'll be able to use intersectionality to analyze the social world around you when you walk away from this class. And so, thinking about how race, class, gender, and other identity categories influence your individual everyday lives, your lived experiences, the way you experience the world, and how other people experience you is heavily influenced by these socially constructed identity categories: age, ability, all those things. However, we can also think about how those identity categories play out structurally within social institutions. So, if we think about structural isms, if you will, racism, sexism, ableism, all those things, we can start to think about how identity categories have more of a macro structural impact within social institutions, within broader society. All right. As always, you have an exit pass this week. I know we're winding down and you're preparing for the final, but do take the time to respond just so I can gauge how everyone's doing and sort of how prepared you feel going into the final exam. Don't forget, discussion board 5 is due this week. So your individual response is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. Your response to a classmate is due Sunday at 11:59 p.m. You've had some time to do your breaking in norm revisions, but don't forget that those are officially due this week. If you don't get your revisions in by now, then you're stuck with the grade that you got, including losing points for not submitting your notes or citing the textbook and things like that. Continue studying for your final exam. Remember, the final exam study guide is on Blackboard. And don't forget, if you don't see a video for next week, week 8, it's our last week. So there's no new readings, no new PowerPoint, and no new video lecture, because I really want you to be able to focus solely on your final exam. All right, good luck on the exam. As always, email me if you have any questions, and I'm always happy to Zoom if anyone needs to meet with me one-on-one in real time. Have a great week, everyone.